In the dim light of a winter morning in 1763, the British Empire stood victorious. The 7 Years' War had ended, and Britain emerged with vast new territories and a sense of unstoppable global power. Yet beneath the triumphant cheers, something darker simmered, a rift forming between the Empire and its American colonists. A rift that neither side fully understood. And one that would, in time, erupt into a revolution unlike anything the world had seen. To understand the American Revolution's untold story, we must go back before the first shot fired at Lexington, before Paul Revere ever mounted his horse, and even before the Sons of Liberty threw tea into Boston Harbor. This is a story not just of battles and declarations, but of ordinary people who were pushed, slowly, painfully, and inevitably, toward rebellion. The year 1763 brought peace, but it also brought debt. Britain had spent staggering sums defending its colonies. And now, the empire expected repayment. For the colonists, who had fought and bled in the same war, this demand felt like a betrayal. They believed they'd earned respect, not restrictions. Yet the British Parliament saw things differently. They believed the colonies needed tighter control, both economically and politically. The seeds of conflict were planted not in anger, but in misunderstanding. When the proclamation line of 1763 was issued, forbidding settlers from moving west of the Appalachians, many colonists were furious. Veterans who had fought for Western lands suddenly found them off-limits. Speculators who had invested heavily in Western territory watched their dreams vanish. To the British, the proclamation was a practical measure to avoid conflict with native nations. To Americans, it felt like an iron gate slammed shut over their future. Then came the Sugar Act of 1764, the first major attempt to enforce taxes. For decades, smuggling had been part of everyday commerce in the colonies, an accepted, unofficial system. Now, harsh regulations and stricter enforcement threatened livelihoods. But more importantly, they threatened autonomy. The colonists believed taxation required representation. London believed the colonists were subjects, not partners. With each new law, the tension tightened. The Stamp Act of 1765 would prove a turning point. Newspapers, licenses, legal documents, even playing cards, now required a stamped British seal. It wasn't the cost that enraged Americans. It was the principle. Parliament was taxing internal colonial affairs without colonial consent. For the first time, the colonies united not as separate entities, but as a collective voice. Crowds gathered in city streets. Effigies of tax collectors hung from trees. Merchants refused British imports. Committees of correspondence formed underground networks that would later become the web of the revolution. The resistance wasn't sudden. It was a slow, steady awakening. But while resistance grew publicly, a quieter transformation unfolded privately. Taverns became political forums. Ordinary men and women debated the nature of freedom. Ministers preached sermons comparing British oppression to biblical tyranny. Pamphlets circulated like wildfire, simple, cheap papers that spread radical ideas faster than any army could march. The colonies were not merely rebelling against laws, they were redefining identity. In London, Parliament pushed back harder. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed new duties on essential goods, glass, paint, paper, tea. British soldiers arrived in major cities to enforce order. Boston, a bustling port city with deep political passion, became a powder keg. Tension between civilians and soldiers boiled over constantly. On a cold March night in 1770, it exploded. Crowds jeered at British sentries. Snowballs flew. Then stones. Then fear. Shots rang out. 5 colonists fell dead. The event would become known as the Boston Massacre, a name crafted by patriots but remembered for centuries. John Adams, defending the accused soldiers, famously said that facts are stubborn things. Yet in the colonies, emotion often outweighed fact. The massacre deepened distrust and pushed moderate voices closer to the revolutionary edge. Still, even after the tragedy, most colonists did not want independence. They wanted rights within the empire. They wanted reform, not separation. But history rarely bends to moderation. In 1773, when Parliament passed the Tea Act, they believed they were helping the struggling British East India Company. Instead, they ignited the most symbolic act of defiance in colonial history. On a frigid December night, disguised men boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped hundreds of tea chests into the icy water. The British were shocked, not by the value of the tea, but by the blatant rejection of authority. The punishment was swift and severe. The coercive acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, shut down Boston's port, restricted town meetings, and placed Massachusetts under military rule. To Parliament, it was necessary discipline. To colonists, it was tyranny made visible. For many Americans, this was the breaking point. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress. It was the first time the colonies acted as a unified political body. The Congress called for boycotts, prepared for armed defense, and sent a respectful petition to the king. But beneath the diplomacy was a growing realization: compromise might no longer be possible. As 1775 dawned, the colonies stood on the edge of a blade. Militias trained quietly in town squares. British troops reinforced positions in Boston. Spies and informants moved through taverns whispering of impending conflict. The question was no longer if blood would be shed, but when. The untold story of the American Revolution is not just about battles. It is about ordinary people becoming extraordinary. It is about how a series of small decisions, misunderstandings, and stubbornness on both sides built a path that neither Britain nor America intended to walk. The world watched casually, unaware that the flicker in the colonies would soon become a firestorm that reshaped global history. And in the darkness before dawn on April 19, 1775, the final spark was struck. The night of April 18, 1775, was unusually still across the Massachusetts countryside. But beneath the quiet, tension pulsed like an invisible current. British General Thomas Gage, under pressure from London to reassert control, finally made his move. His orders were simple: march to Concord, seize colonial weapons, and arrest key rebel leaders. What he did not know was that his secret plan was already unraveling. Boston's Patriot Network, an intricate web of merchants, craftsmen, dockworkers, women, and even sympathetic British soldiers, had been watching closely. They noticed unusual military preparations, whispered conversations among officers, and sudden activity near the harbor. The message spread quickly: the regulars are about to march. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott rode through the night, not shouting a dramatic warning as legends later claimed, but quietly alerting trusted militia captains. Doors opened. Lanterns lit. Farmers, blacksmiths, and young boys grabbed muskets older than themselves. The countryside stirred like a living organism awakening from sleep. By dawn on April 19, 1775, the first chapter of the Revolution erupted on the village green at Lexington. A small company of militia, around 70 men, stood trembling in the early morning fog. Some were veterans of the French and Indian War. Others were teenagers who had never faced battle. Their captain, John Parker, was calm but realistic. "Stand your ground," he told his men, "but don't fire unless fired upon." His order reflected the mindset of the colonies at that moment: resistance, not rebellion. The British column, nearly 700 strong, marched out of the mist. The red of their coats cut through the morning light like a signal flare. The two sides faced each other in a tense, breathless silence. What happened next remains debated to this day. No one knows who fired first. A single shot, maybe an accident, maybe a spark of panic, cracked through the silence. In an instant, chaos erupted. British soldiers fired in volley. Militiamen scrambled for cover. When the smoke cleared, 8 Americans lay dead. The British continued toward Concord, unaware that their morning encounter would be remembered as the shot heard round the world. When the Redcoats reached Concord, they found fewer weapons than expected. Patriots had hidden most supplies the night before. British troops moved to destroy what little they found, tossing gun carriages into flames and pilfering buildings. But the smoke rising from Concord was misinterpreted by militia gathering in the hills. They believed the British were burning the town. Anger replaced fear. On North Bridge, several hundred militiamen advanced in formation, an organized, disciplined force, not the ragtag mob the British expected. As the two sides approached, the British fired warning shots. The militia held their ground, then fired a measured volley that forced the redcoats into retreat. For the first time in the conflict, Americans had fired intentionally, and had driven back the King's troops. The British soon realized they were surrounded. Their retreat to Boston turned into a nightmare. Colonial militia poured in from every direction, farmers leaving fields, artisans closing shops, church deacons abandoning morning chores. They fired from behind stone walls, trees, and barns. This was not European-style warfare. It was personal. By the end of the day, the British suffered nearly 3 times the casualties of the Americans. The war had begun. But the untold story of the Revolution is not only in battles won, it is in the transformation that followed. When news of Lexington and Concord spread, the colonies reacted with a mixture of rage, fear, and reluctant unity. Many hoped for reconciliation, but the bloodshed made that path increasingly distant. Newspapers printed sensational accounts of British atrocities, some exaggerated, some entirely fabricated, but all written with a single goal: to build support for resistance. Within weeks, tens of thousands of militia encircled Boston in what became known as the Siege of Boston. They lacked structure, discipline, and supplies. Yet their numbers stunned the British, who suddenly found themselves trapped on a peninsula surrounded by hostile forces. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress reconvened in Philadelphia. Delegates arrived from every colony, learned lawyers in silk coats, frontier farmers in worn leather, merchants with ink-stained fingers. They debated fiercely: were they forming an army? Were they declaring war? Or were they merely defending rights under the British Constitution? Amid the uncertainty, one proposal changed the course of history: the creation of a unified Continental Army. The choice of its commander was equally important. Many favored someone from New England, where the conflict had begun. But Congress needed unity, political, regional, and symbolic. They turned to a tall, reserved Virginian with battlefield experience, a man known for calm leadership and personal sacrifice, George Washington. When Washington arrived at the siege lines outside Boston, he found an army in name only. Men lacked uniforms, discipline, ammunition, even sanitation. They fought with courage but without structure. Washington imposed order, training, and organization, sometimes against great resistance. His presence alone brought a sense of legitimacy to the cause. But while Washington worked to shape an army, others shaped the revolution's ideas. Print culture exploded. Pamphlets, essays, and letters circulated with unprecedented speed. The most influential voice belonged to a recent immigrant, a corset maker turned writer, Thomas Paine. His pamphlet Common Sense, published in early 1776, electrified the colonies. Paine spoke plainly, passionately, urging Americans to break from the British crown once and for all. Independence, he argued, was not only possible, it was necessary. Common sense spread like wildfire, reaching farmers, artisans, sailors, and shopkeepers. It transformed public opinion in ways Congress could not. Suddenly, independence no longer seemed radical. It seemed inevitable. Yet even as patriot sentiment grew, the Revolution's untold story lies also in the divisions it created. Not all colonists supported the rebellion. Many, perhaps 1/3, remained loyal to the crown. Others simply wished to avoid the conflict. Families were torn apart, businesses ruined, friendships ended. The Revolution was not just a war against Britain, it was a civil war within America. By spring of 1776, the British prepared a massive counterstrike. Reinforcements arrived from England, Ireland, Germany, and other territories. Ships filled Boston Harbor. The king's ministers believed the rebellion could be crushed with one decisive show of force. But the Americans had advantages the British did not understand: deep local support, flexible tactics, and an unwavering belief that they were fighting for their rights, their homes, and their future. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in royal palaces and government halls, the British misunderstood the depth of American resistance. They believed the conflict was driven by a small group of agitators. They believed most colonists still supported the crown. They believed the rebellion would collapse quickly. They were wrong. And when British ships suddenly withdrew from Boston in March 1776, driven out by Washington's bold positioning of newly captured artillery, the world realized the unthinkable: the Americans could actually win. But victory would not come easily. Ahead lay some of the darkest, bloodiest, and most uncertain years in American history. Armies would clash across continents. Spies would operate in shadows. Alliances would shift. And a fragile new nation would be born from the chaos. The revolution was no longer a distant possibility. It was here. It was real. And it was only beginning. In the spring of 1776, the American colonies stood at a crossroads. The bloodshed at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill had forced the uncomfortable truth into the open: this was no longer a dispute over taxes or laws. The conflict had grown too large, too violent, too entrenched. Yet the colonies were not united in purpose. Many still hoped for reconciliation. Others demanded full independence. And between these two visions, the fate of a nation balanced precariously. As Washington prepared defenses around New York, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia wrestled with the most important question in American history: were they willing to break from the most powerful empire on earth? The mood inside Independence Hall shifted daily. Hot, humid air mixed with the smell of ink, wax, and sweat. Delegates argued fiercely. John Adams championed independence with fiery conviction, believing the colonies could no longer coexist with the British crown. Benjamin Franklin, older and wiser, pushed for unity but with careful diplomacy. Meanwhile, men like John Dickinson argued that war and separation would destroy the colonies economically and politically. The debate stretched for weeks. Outside the hall, however, the world was evolving faster than Congress could keep up. Across towns and villages, anger grew. Colonial farmers had seen their barns burned, their rights trampled, their neighbors killed. Soldiers wrote home about brutal fighting and broken promises. Women ran farms, shops, and households alone as their husbands marched off to war. Pamphlets, sermons, and town meetings echoed the same sentiment: the old ties were broken. This growing public pressure created a shift. Independence was no longer a theoretical possibility, it was an unavoidable necessity. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia stood before Congress and introduced a bold resolution. These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The room fell silent. This was treason in the eyes of the British crown. Every man present understood that supporting the resolution could mean the gallows. But they also knew that history rarely offers safe choices. A committee was formed to draft a formal declaration. At its head stood a young Virginian, not yet 35, known for his eloquent pen and quiet brilliance, Thomas Jefferson. Over 17 days, Jefferson crafted a document that blended philosophy, grievance, courage, and hope. He borrowed from Enlightenment thinkers, colonial experiences, and the raw emotion of the moment. The result was a statement unlike any the world had seen. Not merely a break from Britain, but a declaration of human rights, that governments existed to serve the people, not the other way around. On July 2, Congress voted for independence. On July 4, they approved Jefferson's final draft. The United States of America was born. Yet even as bells rang out in Philadelphia and crowds read the Declaration aloud in town squares, the war was far from won. In fact, the colonies now faced the most dangerous moment of the entire conflict. Britain was preparing to strike with overwhelming force. While Congress debated, the British Empire assembled the largest expeditionary force it had ever sent abroad. Dozens of warships, troop transports, and supply vessels stretched across the horizon. British generals believed the rebellion would collapse with one decisive blow. Their target was New York. Washington knew the British were coming. He also knew he could not match their navy, their artillery, or their experienced infantry. But he had no choice but to defend the city, politically, strategically, symbolically. The New York campaign would test the Continental Army in ways Lexington and Concord never had. By late June, British ships filled the waters around Staten Island. The sight terrified American soldiers. Many had never seen a warship before, much less dozens. The thunder of cannons, the gleam of polished bayonets, the rigid discipline of British troops, everything showcased the sheer might of an empire. Washington's men, poorly trained and poorly equipped, braced themselves. On August 27, 1776, the Battle of Long Island began. It was the first major engagement of the war after independence, and the Americans were disastrously outmaneuvered. British troops launched a surprise flanking attack, overwhelming American lines. Smoke filled the air as cannon roar echoed through the forests. Soldiers fled in confusion. Washington, watching from a ridge, could do little except attempt to rally retreating units. By nightfall, the Continental Army was cornered, trapped against the East River with no escape. But Washington refused to surrender. In one of the most daring moves of the war, he ordered a nighttime evacuation. Under the cover of thick fog, so dense that British sentries could barely see a few feet ahead, American soldiers silently boarded boats and slipped across the river to Manhattan. When the sun rose, the British were stunned to find the American army had vanished. Washington's escape preserved the revolution. But the retreat did not end there. The British pursued relentlessly. Washington's forces were pushed from Manhattan to Harlem, from Harlem to White Plains, from White Plains to New Jersey. Each retreat chipped away at morale. Some enlisted soldiers deserted. Others questioned whether independence had been a mistake. As winter approached, the Continental Army was in shambles. Supplies were scarce. Shoes were rare. Men wrapped rags around their feet to keep from freezing. Disease took more lives than bullets. Washington wrote private letters to Congress filled with despair, warning that the army might not survive the winter. Across the colonies, fear spread. Was the revolution already collapsing? In London, the British celebrated. They believed they had won. Rebel leaders fled. Cities fell to British control. Loyalists regained influence. The empire believed the rebellion would soon crumble. But the untold story of the revolution is how often victory emerged from moments of near destruction. With his army on the brink of collapse, Washington made a bold decision, one that would change the course of the war. Instead of waiting for disaster, he took the offensive. On Christmas night, 1776, in driving snow and freezing winds, Washington led his troops across the icy Delaware River. Many soldiers had no boots. Ice shattered against the wooden hulls of their boats. But Washington knew they had one advantage, the element of surprise. At dawn, the Continental Army marched into Trenton, New Jersey, overwhelming the Hessian garrison. It was a small tactical victory, but a massive psychological one. For the first time in months, Americans believed the revolution could survive. A week later, Washington struck again at Princeton. These victories were not just military successes, they were symbolic lifelines. They revived hope. They convinced men to re-enlist. They proved that the British were not invincible. As 1777 dawned, the revolution stood transformed. The Americans were no longer a desperate collection of militias. They were a nation with a cause, an army with a leader, and a people willing to sacrifice everything for freedom. Independence had been declared. Now it had to be defended. The world was watching. And the struggle for America's future was about to enter its most pivotal phase. The winter of 1777 arrived not with the fury of storms but with the heavy weight of uncertainty. Though the victories at Trenton and Princeton had breathed life back into the Revolution, the Continental Army remained weak, outnumbered, and constantly on the brink of collapse. Washington knew that morale alone could not win the war. If the United States were to survive, it needed something far greater: international recognition, foreign support, and allies willing to challenge the British Empire. But before diplomacy could succeed, the Americans needed a battlefield victory significant enough to prove their cause was not hopeless. That moment came in the dense forests and winding rivers of upstate New York. In 1777, Britain launched a grand strategy to crush the rebellion by dividing the colonies. Their plan was simple: isolate New England, the heart of the rebellion, from the middle and southern colonies. If the British could seize the Hudson River Valley, they believed the revolution would collapse like a severed limb. General John Burgoyne, a confident and flamboyant officer, led a massive British force south from Canada. His army included British regulars, German auxiliaries, native allies, and loyalist fighters. Burgoyne marched with elegance and arrogance, traveling with fine clothing, silver dining sets, and crates of wine. He expected a swift victory. But the American resistance in the north was stronger than the British anticipated. Militia poured in from New York, New England, and the frontier. Farmers left fields unplanted. Blacksmiths abandoned their forges. Men who had never traveled beyond their towns marched miles to defend the Hudson Valley. They fought not for glory but for survival. At the center of the resistance stood General Horatio Gates, a cautious but politically savvy officer. Under him served a fiery, unpredictable, and brilliant commander, Benedict Arnold, who, before his betrayal, was one of America's greatest battlefield leaders. The first major engagement, at Freeman's Farm, shook Burgoyne's confidence. The American forces struck with brutal accuracy. Arnold's men harassed British formations, then disappeared into the trees. The battle ended indecisively, but Burgoyne's losses were heavy. Weeks later, at Bemis Heights, the American army struck again, this time with overwhelming force. Arnold, defying Gates's orders, charged into the battle, rallying troops, breaking British lines, and turning the tide of the fight. His leg was shattered by musket fire, but his courage electrified the battlefield. Burgoyne's army, bleeding, exhausted, and surrounded, had no escape. On October 17, 1777, the British surrendered at Saratoga. It was a moment the world could not ignore. News of Saratoga traveled across the Atlantic like a spark to dry tinder. For years, France, Britain's ancient rival, had watched the American rebellion with interest but hesitation. They feared backing a lost cause. Saratoga changed everything. In February 1778, France formally recognized the United States and signed a military alliance. French money, soldiers, naval power, and supplies surged into the American cause. For the first time, the revolution stood on equal footing with Britain. Yet even as diplomacy flourished, the harsh reality of war remained. While diplomats celebrated in Europe, Washington's army endured the darkest winter of the war at Valley Forge. Snow covered the ground like a burial shroud. The air was sharp, cold, untrusting. Thousands of soldiers lacked coats, shoes, or blankets. Food was so scarce that men boiled leather for broth. Disease, typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, ravaged the encampment. It was not British muskets that threatened the revolution that winter, it was hunger, disease, and despair. Washington walked among his starving men daily, sharing their suffering. But leadership alone could not save the army. Survival came from an unexpected source, a former Prussian officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben. Von Steuben, eccentric and charismatic, drilled the Continental Army relentlessly. He taught them discipline, precision, formation tactics, skills they desperately needed. His blend of strict training and colorful language, translated politely by his aides, transformed a freezing, disorganized force into a disciplined, united army. By spring, the soldiers who had limped into Valley Forge marched out as professionals. In June 1778, the British evacuated Philadelphia and marched across New Jersey. Washington saw an opportunity, proof that his army had been reborn. Near the small town of Monmouth, the Continental Army clashed with the British in a brutal, sweltering battle. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Men collapsed from heat stroke. Muskets misfired in the humid air. cannon wheels sank into the mud. But something remarkable happened. For the first time, the Americans met the British in open field combat and held their own. The battle ended in a tactical draw, but strategically it proved something much greater. The Continental Army could now stand toe-to-toe with the best-trained army in the world. Monmouth also produced one of the Revolution's most enduring legends, Molly Pitcher, inspired by the women who carried water to men on the front lines, braving enemy fire to cool cannons and save lives. By 1779, the British realized the northern colonies were too rebellious, too entrenched, too unified to conquer quickly. So they shifted their focus south, believing Loyalist support would turn the tide. For a time, it worked. Savannah fell. Charleston collapsed in a devastating defeat. American forces in the Carolinas were torn apart. Guerrilla warfare, brutal, bloody, personal, spread across the countryside. Families fought families. Neighbors turned on one another. The revolution in the South looked less like an orderly war and more like chaos with muskets. But the British underestimated the resilience of Southern patriots. Figures like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, a master of ambush and hit-and-run tactics, harassed the British at every turn. General Nathanael Greene, Washington's most trusted commander, adopted a strategy of fight, retreat, exhaust. He lost battles but won the war of attrition, draining British strength until they controlled only the land under their marching feet. Step by step, the British grip on the South loosened. A shift in the global storm as the American war intensified, Britain's troubles multiplied. France entered the conflict. Spain joined the fight soon after. The Netherlands offered financial support. The war sprawled across oceans, continents, and colonies. Battles erupted in the Caribbean, West Africa, India, and at sea. The British Empire, once unshakable, was stretched thin. Meanwhile, in America, the combination of French support and American resolve created a slow but unstoppable momentum. The tide was turning. The revolution was no longer a desperate rebellion. It was a global conflict with the world's greatest superpower on one side, and a growing alliance of nations on the other. And at the center of this storm, the American people, farmers, merchants, slaves, soldiers, women, children, continued to fight, sacrifice, and endure. Ahead lay the most decisive moment of the entire war. A moment born from strategy, courage, and fate. A moment that would bring the revolution to its climax. The road to Yorktown had begun. By the summer of 1781, the American Revolution had entered its seventh brutal year. The war had stretched across forests, mountains, rivers, and oceans. It had consumed towns, families, fortunes, and lives. And yet neither side held a decisive victory. The British controlled major cities, New York, Charleston, Savannah, but they were losing control of the hinterlands and the will of the American people. The Continental Army, battered but unbroken, continued to fight with a resolve that astonished even its allies. Still, the revolution seemed suspended in uncertainty. Morale was fragile. Supplies were scarce. Soldiers went months without pay. Mutinies erupted in the ranks. Inflation devastated the economy. Many Americans wondered if independence had been a dream too costly to afford. And then, just when the revolution seemed most vulnerable, fate intervened. The path to Yorktown. British General Charles Cornwallis, leading the Southern campaign, had fought Nathanael Greene through the Carolinas in a series of grueling battles. Though he won many engagements, his victories came at a staggering cost. Greene's relentless strategy, fight, retreat, exhaust, left Cornwallis with an army too worn to continue deep inland. Seeking rest and resupply, Cornwallis marched to the Virginia coast and fortified the small port town of Yorktown. To him, Yorktown was a strategic refuge. To Washington, it was an opportunity. For years, Washington had faced frustration, superior British forces, lacking supplies, political divisions within Congress, and spies reporting his every move. Yet now, for the first time, he saw a path not merely to survival, but to victory. At that same moment, a powerful French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed toward the American coast. and General Rochambeau, commanding elite French infantry, joined Washington with thousands of seasoned soldiers. The convergence of forces was nothing short of miraculous. Washington made his decision risky, audacious, unprecedented. He would strike at Yorktown with everything he had. But first, he needed to deceive the British. Washington's great deception. British commanders in New York believed Washington planned to attack Manhattan. Washington fed that illusion brilliantly, sending fake letters, staging false troop movements, even building makeshift encampments visible to British spies. Then, with breathtaking speed, he marched his army, both American and French, south toward Virginia. Hundreds of miles. In scorching heat. In secrecy. It was one of the greatest strategic maneuvers in American history. By late September, the trap had closed. Cornwallis found himself surrounded by Washington on land and de Grasse at sea. The British Navy tried to break the French blockade at the Battle of the Chesapeake, but failed. With no reinforcements, no escape, and dwindling supplies, Cornwallis's position became hopeless. The siege of Yorktown had begun. The siege. American and French artillery roared day and night. Cannonballs crashed into British trenches. Earthworks exploded in fire and dust. Cornwallis's men huddled in bunkers as their defenses crumbled inch by inch. Two key redoubts, number 9 and number 10, protected the British line. As long as they stood, Cornwallis had hope. Washington knew they had to be taken. On the night of October 14, 1781, under the cloak of darkness, the Allies launched their assault. French forces attacked Redoubt No. 9 with bayonets fixed, scaling walls under blistering fire. American forces attacked Redoubt No. 10, led by a young commander who would later become the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. With swords drawn and the order to use no gunpowder, Americans climbed the defenses and overwhelmed the redoubt in minutes. By dawn, both positions had fallen. Cornwallis knew the end had come. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered. As British soldiers marched out, their fifes and drums played a tune rumored to be "The World Turned Upside Down." And indeed, it had. The most powerful empire in the world had been humbled by farmers, shopkeepers, apprentices, soldiers, and an idea that people could govern themselves. Yorktown did not officially end the war, but it broke Britain's will to continue fighting. Negotiations dragged on for 2 more years, but the outcome was inevitable. In September 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. The United States of America was formally recognized as a sovereign, independent nation. The revolution had succeeded. But the story was not over. The unfinished revolution. Independence brought triumph, but also profound challenges. America now faced the daunting task of building a nation from scratch. There was no blueprint, no precedent for a republic of such size, diversity, and ambition. The Articles of Confederation proved weak. Congress struggled with debt, foreign threats, and internal division. Yet amid the turmoil, remarkable leaders rose. Washington retired to Mount Vernon, hoping to return to private life. But his country needed him again. When the Constitutional Convention gathered in 1787, delegates unanimously chose Washington to preside. The result was the United States Constitution, a bold framework that balanced federal authority with individual liberty. The Revolution had created a nation, but the Constitution gave that nation structure. Still, many voices remained unheard in this new republic. Women, despite crucial roles in the war, were denied political rights. Enslaved Africans, who fought on both sides, remained in bondage, an unresolved contradiction in the very nation founded on liberty. Native nations, who had seen their lands and treaties violated, faced further displacement. These struggles would shape and scar the nation for generations. The American Revolution, as heroic as it was, remained incomplete. Legacies and shadows. The war produced towering figures: Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Hamilton, and countless others whose names live on. But the untold story is in the ordinary people, the farmers at Lexington, the mothers at Valley Forge, The sailors at the Chesapeake. The spies who risked everything. The enslaved men and women who sought freedom. The native warriors defending ancestral lands. The Revolution's legacy belongs to all of them. And the world felt its impact. Revolutions erupted in France, Haiti, Latin America, and beyond. The idea that ordinary people could resist empire and claim their rights spread like wildfire. The American Revolution did not just change one nation. It changed the world. As the dust settled on battlefields and treaties dried with ink, something extraordinary had happened. A scattered collection of colonies, bound together by chance and circumstance, had transformed into a country born from ideals, fragile, imperfect, but determined. The United States began not with certainty, but with questions. Not with power, but with hope. Not with uniformity, but with debate. And its people, diverse, determined, flawed, and fearless, chose to build something new, something untried, something revolutionary. From the moment the first shot echoed on Lexington Green to the moment Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, one truth endured. The American Revolution was not just a war. It was a declaration of humanity's oldest dream. That people should govern themselves. And that dream, once ignited, could never again be extinguished.